I wanted to do something kind of fun today, which is just to take up the question of how to, the challenge I think we're really facing right now in the United States is because of conditions over decades, Americans have a very hard time thinking straight. And I'll just say that the reason why Trump won the election in 2016 was because of the decades of destruction of the country, particularly the last 16 years since 9/11, or 17 years under both Bush and Barack Obama. And remember what Trump said. He said no more regime change wars, which is a far bigger deal than I think people mentioned. He also went after the Iraq war being based on lies. People have heard this. He says we spent $7 trillion on this thing. For what? There were no weapons of mass destruction. And you have to realize, since 9/11, does anyone know how many Americans have served in Iraq or Afghanistan?
50,000.
2.7 million.
Really?
2.7 million, and 977,000 of those have been on 2 or more tours. My sister served in Iraq. Her husband did 2 tours in Iraq. I don't know if people here, you probably have family members or, you know, either immediate or remote family members who have been in Iraq or Afghanistan. Think about what the people who have been there know about what happened in these wars. And think about the sense, I think one of the reasons, I mean, you have PTSD obviously from trauma, but you also have depression and despair, because if you go and your comrade dies in a situation that only becomes worse because of our presence, think about the impact on your morale. Before Saddam Hussein was killed, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That came in as a result of our actions. And people know here that, remember, this was somehow what Cheney and Bush did based on evidence from the British MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove, Christopher Steele's boss, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Somehow the 9/11 attacks, where you had 14 out of 19 hijackers from Saudi Arabia, got twisted into an invasion of Iraq. And then you had, with Hillary Clinton and Obama, the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. Well, how much better is Libya now for that brilliant intervention? So this actually was a major issue in the election, and the media tries to downplay it, but I can tell you in the organizing in the street, this question of war and peace is very big for Americans. Now, Keisha already said that this year and this midterm election is crucial. I just want to show you, which one do I push, the red one?
No, that's the laser.
Oh.
Forward one.
Is this forward? Whoa, okay, great. This is something Linda LaRouche came up with in 1996, and it's slightly changed because in 2007, 2008, they printed so much money. But what you're looking at, look at that, is you can see this physical, economic input and output, this curve going down. And you see this starting point, 65. Prior to 65, these areas were actually related to each other. That is, physical output, financial aggregates, and monetary aggregates. But what happened in 67, for example, you slashed the space program, we began shutting down industry and manufacturing. People heard the term the service economy or the post-industrial economy, where somehow you're supposed to have an economy where you don't produce anything and we all have services. So what happened is you were actually printing money and generating financial interests in such a way that you were looting the physical economy. So you have two curves, that the more the stock market went up, the poorer the nation got physically. The more the financial interest went up, the more you had potholes and rotting sewage systems. And because later of this, right here, there's a cross point, which is where, I think it's actually a little later, but the crash of 2007, 2008, remember what happened? Quantitative easing, $700 billion here, $700 billion there, you know, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. And if you worked for a company that caused the mess, you could be sure at Christmas you would get a multi-million-dollar bonus. My favorite quote was from a barber in Connecticut at that time who said, you know, if I cut someone's ear off when I was cutting their hair, I wouldn't expect to get a tip. But the people who did this so we started printing money at such a rate that the amount of money in circulation or on computer screens being wired back and forth all over the planet was going up even at a faster rate than these financial instruments. And what you had in Dodd-Frank, people have heard the term bailout. Does anyone know what bail-in is? Bail-in is when this thing blows, as it absolutely has to. And this is a major vulnerability of President Trump because people can decide to pull the plug on it and detonate the markets before the elections, which would be very devastating. When this thing crashes, what was in Dodd-Frank is that the priority is the derivatives obligations of the banks, not your savings account. So the bank, this happened in Italy in some cases, where the bank converts your savings into bank stocks, declares it to be worth 5 cents on the dollar, and takes all of your savings in a wild attempt to bail out their derivatives losses, which is physically impossible because the amount of derivatives is in the quadrillions of dollars. It's all insane. It's completely out of whack. So LaRouche did this in 1996, warning that what you were headed for was a kind of a shock front, and that these curves, that they are related. It's not that the physical economy is just disintegrating, but it's disintegrating at the same rate that the financial investments are getting out of control. And he warned that we were headed for a major crash. Now, that has real consequences, and it has real consequences on our culture, which I've been thinking about a lot lately. I mean, think about things that used to be productive or where you could make a living, like a farmer. Farmers can't make a living now. The cost of production is more than what they get for selling their produce. Every family farmer has like 5 other things that they're doing, whether it's real estate or driving for Uber or I don't know what, trying to support their ability to feed people. The only farms that make money are these mega things, which are actually very dangerous for the health hazards and things that they create. So that's not productive. Think about what you spend on just living, like driving from New Jersey to here today, $30 in tolls, how much in gas, and of course we know those tolls are to take really good care of the roads, right? Those roads are just beautiful. Or think about how much it costs to rent or to pay a mortgage on a small house or an apartment, say two bedrooms. Suppose a 2-bedroom apartment is $2,000 a month. I don't know what it is in Long Island, but in northern Jersey and maybe Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, of course, it's way more. It can be $8,000 a month or whatever for 2 bedrooms. But you remember the old rule of thumb that your rent should be about a quarter, maybe a third of your income. So by that standard, you should be making $7,500 a month. Well, that's $90,000 a year. Now, what's the poverty level officially according to the government for a family of 4? It's $25,100. It may vary from area to area, but so think about that. You're not below the poverty line until you're making less than $25,000. But it costs, you should have an income of $90,000 to have a small apartment. And if you go on to say, well, if you have 4 people in your family, you really should have at least 3 bedrooms, then you're talking $2,500 or $3,000 for mortgage or rent. Also, people may have heard there was a study recently that over 50% of Americans do not have savings, that is cash. They may have other stuff, but over 50% of Americans do not have $500 to $1,000 for an emergency expense. Now, we also know part of this is the banks pay nothing in terms of interest. You get to pay $1 million in interest, but what you make on your savings is nothing. So think about this. Think about what your income should be relative to what the cost of living actually is. Then think about how people get by. What's the level of indebtedness? Student loan debt, car debt, mortgage debt, debt that people owe friends and family members, credit card debt. Does anyone think that this might cause anxiety? How are families staying together? I mean, what do you think is the #1 reason for marriages falling apart?
Financial.
Exactly, this kind of thing. So so people are going through this hell, really. And on top of this, where everyone is living in the state of complete extreme anxiety, and you see it come out everywhere, road rage, things in the groceries, people just act crazy because everyone's sort of on the edge. And then you get the fake news bombarding you, and I got a real sense of this. My husband and I were out for dinner with his aunt, and she has these news alerts, and they start going off every 10 minutes. Trump is killing the remaining 10 endangered species. That was an actual news flash. Kavanaugh gang raped 15 women. The Chinese are stealing your underwear. Russians are poisoning your dog. You know, the aliens are coming. The sky is falling. I mean, the news is like that. It is like that. My father is a psychiatrist, semi-retired, and he told me that he and other psychiatrists actually tell many of their patients, especially if they suffer from schizophrenia or other diseases, do not watch the news. It's actually a mental health hazard, and doctors know this. So think about that. So what's the solution? I know no one should suffer. I mean, if you're about to get foreclosed upon and lose your house and your home and your kids on drugs, it would be terrible to be anxiety-ridden about that. You should take drugs yourself.
Take a pill.
So you can feel better. I mean, it is a cultural thing. It's really sick. You're living in a world that's insane, but you're not supposed to feel like it's insane because that's bad for you. So better, smoke pot or something. And I have to tell you, I don't have time to go through the whole study, but I did want to tell you because the Attorney General of Colorado just came out with a report which is absolutely devastating on the results of having legalized marijuana. And there's many things, from car accidents increasing, car fatalities increasing, 35% more fatal car accidents, marijuana-related traffic deaths went up by 151%. Here's my favorite though, because doesn't everyone tell you, oh, no, pot will reduce crime because it makes you so mellow. Well, violent crime increased 18.6% in Colorado after legalizing recreational marijuana, and property crime has increased by 8.3%. And they have record numbers of children going to the emergency room, and all
And
kinds
dogs.
of things. And dogs, yes.
Yeah.
People's pets are getting into it and getting poisoned,
dogs.
yeah. It's really,
Dogs and cats.
so you just think about
All in the
this.
name of tax revenue.
Yeah, right.
Suppose.
That's the lie. And then, of course, the revenue, that's the other thing the report goes through. The revenue is nothing like what they tell you it's going to be. It's just all not true. So I actually think that we are going to conquer all of this, but it is a problem that Americans have become so bombarded, particularly the last 50, 60 years, that we have somehow come to accept things that decades ago we would have said are totally insane. And I want to take up this question of how to think or how to know if something is true or not. A lot of people might refer to it as common sense. People don't have common sense. You hear that. LaRouche would refer to that as reason. That is not logic, but reason. And it is a question of whether there's such a thing as truth. And you can consider, I was thinking your friend there was talking about Einstein, or you brought up Einstein, because Einstein was often accused of being an atheist, which he absolutely was not. He was Jewish, but not practicing in that way, but he said the more that he discovered about the universe, the more he discovered things, the more it was obvious that the universe had to have a creator, that it could not be like this. But what is the approach of a religious person or a scientist? One approach of say a religious person, you say, well, God is perfect. God embodies perfection. But we are in the physical domain, or you've heard, we are seeing through a glass darkly. But as human beings, we have the challenge to become perfect. In science, what happens with a scientist? You see a phenomenon, you observe something, you have a hypothesis about why it's happening, and you construct an experiment to determine, is this true? Is this why it's happening, or is this not happening? Well, so as I thought about this some more, I thought about this. What is this? Well, it's a circle with a radius, yes. So here's, I think, something interesting to consider. It's a circle with a radius. How would you construct a circle? Suppose you had a point in the middle and maybe a piece of string.
Is it a question? What is
Yeah, I'm asking.
Just, go
Go
around
around,
the
right.
point.
So you take your pencil or whatever with your string and you make this circle around the radius. And the idea of the circle is that every point on the circle is equidistant from the center. That's the idea.
For the perfect circle.
The perfect circle, exactly. Now, suppose I gave everyone here a piece of paper and we all had the same piece of string, and we took turns using the same piece of string and the same pencil, and we each made a circle. And then we each cut out our circle, and suppose I took my circle and Carl's circle and we put them up right against each other in the light. What do you think we would find out?
Difference.
Yeah, difference.
That's right. They wouldn't be perfect. They would have little,
Variation.
that's right. It wouldn't be perfect. So now here's the interesting thing, which is what Socrates was working on, this question of truth, and Plato. Well, so clearly there seem to be two circles, because there's one circle in your mind, that is, your mind can actually comprehend a perfect circle, because we can imagine a circle where the circumference is equidistant from the radius. We appreciate that principle. But when we go to construct the circle in the domain that we are living in, we cannot construct the perfect circle. And I think one interesting question to consider is, which of these circles is the one that is going to last the longest? It's an interesting question, right? Now, this little thought exercise we just did on the question of the perfect circle versus the one that we just made, does anyone here have a dog, fish, parakeet that you could have a discussion with them about this? You think a dog can imagine a perfect circle? So this is the amazing thing, because you see in just this little exercise that human beings are completely, there is not a linear connection between a human being and an animal. That our creative reason, our ability to make a discovery, to understand an eternal concept or principle is unique to all living species. And I say this because everyone has had the experience when you discover something that you couldn't solve before. You know, they have the little cartoons with the little light bulb that goes off in your head. But it's also a sense of happiness. You know, you have this problem, it's not working, it's not coming out right, and suddenly something clicks and you realize you were looking at it from the wrong angle or something else.
You mean the aha moment?
Yeah, exactly. And that, I would submit, is what Leibniz in our Declaration of Independence, when it says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they don't mean life, liberty, and pleasure. They don't mean life, liberty, and do whatever feels good. They mean what makes human beings happy is when we become closer to perfection, that we make a breakthrough where we become closer in our mind to the creator of the universe. And this is extremely important because this identity of mankind is the thing that has been totally under attack in our culture. What is this obsession with your identity and your gender, and that there's no difference between you and an animal, or what children are taught? No, human beings are bad because they're violent, animals are non-violent. Now, they don't have those nature shows anymore, I guess, or, you know, or no one ever had a cat, watched it kill a mouse or anything like that. Really terrible. So LaRouche's contribution is that he, continuing on with people like Alexander Hamilton and people before Hamilton and after, but that given this unique quality of man, a leap in the development of the universe, that the center of measure of your economic success is not money, right? And we can go back to this diagram because we keep hearing the stock market was over 25,000 or whatever. That's not the measure. The measure of the success of your it has to be in terms of the most important thing in the universe, which is mankind, which is human existence. And what LaRouche developed as an economist is two terms. One, potential relative population density, and the other, energy flux density. And just in a nutshell, without going through it, but I think you can gather by the words what it is, that we have a certain population density where we are right now. And I forget what I figured out. I looked it up for Long Island. It was 52 people per square mile or something. I don't remember what it was. But if you have electricity, if you have running water, if you have a nuclear power plant, then you can sustain a large number of people fairly comfortably in a relatively small area of land. And the potential of what you can sustain is hopefully larger than what you have, or what you're going to see is the death rate increasing, which is what we have now in the United States. But at any rate, if you go back to burning wood, or you say you don't even burn wood, suppose you didn't even cook your food and you're just scratching around for bugs, probably a square mile would not be enough to feed a person. So you'd have to have many miles of land to sustain a person who would probably die by the time they were 22 years old. But when you develop electricity, running water, you figure out how to grow food, what happens is, contrary to the environmentalists, you discover that your resources, because of the energy you put in, actually increase at a geometric rate, and your population can increase at a geometric rate. So you can take a case like the state of New Jersey, which has 1,200 people per square mile, has a lot of farmland, and if you extrapolated and said the whole United States could have that population, the whole United States could have 4.6 billion people in the same. But we hear that the terrible threat to the world is overpopulation. It's not population, it has nothing to do with it. It's the question,
Stagnation.
well, and development. If you're not gonna have electricity, if you're not gonna have clean drinking water, obviously you can't sustain your population. And the other term, I said energy flux density, I think you're probably gathering that burning wood is not the most efficient use of trees for energy because you don't get that much energy. Probably the most inefficient kinds of energy are solar panels and windmills, where you need like football fields for miles of solar panels to get not very much energy, and the windmills are completely unreliable. But if you develop nuclear power, you need a tiny, tiny amount of fuel to get a massive amount of energy. We should have developed fusion by now, and beyond fusion, we should maybe plasma, antimatter, matter, I mean, there's really great things we could be doing where you could get massive, massive amounts of energy with this much fuel. And then think about the standard of living. How could people live under those conditions? What if you never had to pay another electric bill and you could consume as much electricity as you wanted? And we had robots that were really good at vacuuming our houses and things like that, But what LaRouche said, so it's not simply increasing your population, but also what is the quality of the human being in that society, that the future generations should be better people. That if you are developing your economy in this way, you're going to have more great classical composers and poets and more Einsteins, because people are not going to be in this state of high anxiety trying to grub out an existence, but they're going to have room for play of the mind and to engage in things that are actually creative. So now I wanted to get to what I said in the last email, which is, now that the Kavanaugh thing has failed, they have thrown a new piece of spectacular BS and disinformation, which keeps coming up every so often, which is the IPCC report. People heard of this? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they have concluded that due to carbon dioxide, the temperature of the plane, you see this woman has a sunburn, that obviously confirms what's happening. That due to the increase in carbon dioxide, the planet is heating up. And some reporter at ABC was good enough to write a little story, which I excerpted, you don't have to hear the whole thing, about all the terrible things that are going to happen to us as a result of the temperature going up by 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is about little less than 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so here's the poor girl. They say, meet Casey X. She was born in Alice Springs, this is in Australia, Alice Springs Hospital on October 13th, 2018. Now, she's 22 years old, October 13th, 2040. But she's thinking about leaving. Extreme hot days in Alice Springs hit 48 degrees Celsius, that's 118 Fahrenheit. The year that she was born, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicted that today the world would be 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution. That didn't sound like much, but now, to save power, she only cranks her AC on when it gets to be over 35, which is about 95 degrees, 35 degrees Celsius. But she's had to run it more than 110 days this year. In Australia's 5 largest cities, 475 people die from heat-related deaths each year. Australia has a new hottest temperature, 53 degrees Celsius at Marble Bar, and I didn't figure that out. It's probably 130 or something. Alice Springs is in the middle of a heat wave. Keeping things alive in the garden at these temperatures is next to impossible. plants are pushed beyond their thresholds and die from heat shock. The animals that eat them go soon after. She was 14 years old the last time the Todd River flowed. And it's all dried up. The cotton crops along the Murray, Darling, and southern Queensland weren't planted because of the drought. However, Russia's wheat industry is going gangbusters, because you know the Russians are behind global warming too, I guess they're about to tell us. I mean, I couldn't believe this article. And not only that, her one true love, coffee, is getting more expensive. And most of the smaller cropping fruits she buys from the supermarket, like tomatoes and lettuce, now have to be grown indoors in greenhouses. Oh, can you imagine having to get your vegetables from a greenhouse? This is terrible. Most of the reef is dying in the north. Some hardier coral species have survived, but the diversity and color are gone, and no one wants to go snorkeling in algae. It's a choice between the Gold and Sunshine Coast, but the deadly Irukandji jellyfish are showing up. So global warming is going to be totally devastating. It's going to be 100 degrees all the time. Poison jellyfish are going to wash up on the shores. All your plants are going to die. The animals are going to die. And there's going to be millions more refugees caused by the rising sea level. So this is what they're telling us. Okay, and what are you supposed to do about it? Cut carbon emissions by 90%. Okay, 90%. And think about Germany. This is hilarious. Germany shut down all their nuclear power plants after Fukushima. So they're going to have no coal, no gas, no nuclear. Do you think they're going to produce Mercedes-Benz anymore? Forget it. Nothing. Nothing. It's talk about mass suicide. Anyway, now, so let's actually think this through a little bit. Does anyone know when was the first time that you could actually measure the temperature of the Earth with mercury? When was the first time? How many years ago could we actually measure temperature?
The Earth's temperature.
Close, yeah, 170 years ago.
Oh.
Okay, 107, in the 1850s. Now, they claim that you can tell the temperatures going back 1,000 years, and I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. This is the Thames River freezing over in a really cold spell in 1814, and apparently in the 1600s, and it always breaks my heart. I don't know if people have gone to Delaware, the Delaware River where George Washington crossed, but that crossing, I think, was in a period of extreme cold. So you think about these soldiers with no shoes and the river being half frozen over, and I mean, it was brutal cold that Christmas when they did that. This similarly, so you've had periods, they had these frost fairs going back to the 1600s. So I'm going to be very generous and say, well, even though you couldn't measure the temperature, you know, if you were out there building camps on top of the river and so on, it was pretty darn cold. So we'll say that you can estimate the temperature maybe going back for 1,000 years. Now, how long has our planet existed?
4.5 billion.
Yes, about 4.5 billion years. So what is 1,000 years in relation to 4.5 billion years?
A grain of salt.
Yeah, it's one over 4.5 million. Okay, it's not even 1,000th or a 10,000th of a percent. So you are going to, these scientists are telling us that based on this much time in the development of the planet Earth, that they are going to project what the temperature is going to be in the year 2030. Now, you may have noticed that they can't even tell you what the weather is going to be tomorrow. I mean, it is outrageous, and this is what I'm saying about the media. So you're not even supposed to think about this. You're not even supposed to.
We'll think about it for you.
Yeah, exactly.
And just
but to
believe us.
consider that it's this much time, that would be like, you know, I mean, you can think of all
Well,
kinds.
it'd be true if they were saying, this is gonna happen in 20,000 years, we'll tell you what the temperature, but they're saying in 20 years.
Wait, but why would they know what it's going to be in 20,000 years?
Well, that's more crazy, but if they're gonna say what it's gonna be
That's the
in
point.
10 years or 20 years.
It's all
that
crazy. They
is-
don't know a damn thing. And that's our own fault because we shut down. Look, you may have heard in the last 2 days, the Soyuz rocket could not get the Russian and American cosmonaut up to the space station. And this is terrible. I'm sure the Russians will figure it out. We've been relying on them and they've got a pretty good record. But why can't we get our astronauts to the space station? We can't do it. We could not go back to the moon again right now. That's what I was talking about earlier, that we shut down the space program actually in '67. We were supposed to do 3 more landings on the moon that all got eliminated. So we managed to get there in '69, but there was a lot more that Kennedy and people at NASA wanted to do, and we just never bothered to do it. Now, what might we know about the weather and the universe if we had maintained our space program those 50, 60 years ago? How do we know? I mean, here's a question I had. How do we know that the greatest threat facing us right now is not that the super volcano that's under Yellowstone National Park is going to blow and spew tons of volcanic ash, which happened centuries ago in Italy, and it changed the temperature of the planet for years because it's like nuclear winter, a similar thing, but volcano can do this. You get all this ash, the sun gets blocked, the plants die, everything freezes. I mean, that would be bad. How are we at predicting when volcanoes are going to blow?
Not.
We didn't see it coming in Hawaii just recently, right? So we can't even figure out that. Or what about asteroids and comets that are about to hit the planet? I mean, 65 million years ago or so, it seems to be the case that a fairly large meteor smashed down in the Gulf of Mexico, and that had enough of an effect to create, you know, probably a great global cooling, which killed off the dinosaurs. And yeah, and not only the dinosaurs, but probably 90% of all species died at that time. So since we can't even get astronauts, frankly, NASA has been so cut, we can't even send astronauts to Germany to participate in a conference, let alone get them up to the space station. You think we can stop an asteroid from hitting our planet? And we know the damage that would do. Okay, so now think of all of these things, and I am not a scientist and don't profess to be, but we just looked at all these things together and I think can reach a conclusion that these people don't know what they're talking about. These people are telling us, I mean, this is so hilarious. They are telling us that they know that if we cut carbon emissions by a certain amount, that this is going to change the temperature of the planet. I mean, this is beyond, but how many young people, and we've met them, who tell us this, that are hysterical. They're convinced that this planet is just going to blow up. And they have no sense of being able to think for themselves to know that this is not the case. Now, I wanted to just show you a few things that we do know, which are just a starting point to understand this. This will come as a great shock to everyone here. The number one factor of temperature on the planet is the sun.
That big orange thing?
Yeah, the sun. And this is a great picture. Apparently, this is one of the largest coronal mass ejections that's occurred in a long time. That's like when you see sunspots, there's all this activity. And the interesting thing about, there's one is is these sunstorms can create massive magnetic field and magnetic perturbations. And some scientists are looking at, is there a correlation between a coronal mass ejection and an earthquake or a volcano? Because they affect the magnetosphere, they affect what the Earth is in. But one thing which does seem to be the case is that the more active the sun is, the more powerful the magnetic field around the Earth. And when that field is powerful, cosmic rays from other galaxies that would be hitting us, people know that when our spaceships go out of the sun's magnetic field, you have a danger of intense cosmic radiation and all kinds of things that we don't know about yet. But the magnetic field is protecting us. When the sun is relatively calm, then the magnetic field is weaker and more of the cosmic rays come through. And this is a chart by a Danish scientist, Svensmark, showing the correlation between cosmic rays coming through and cloud formation. And that seems to be fairly correlated. That is, you get, those curves are pretty similar. The red one is cosmic rays, the blue one is low cloud cover. Now when you get cloud cover, what happens to the temperature?
Cools.
That's right. So when the sun is less active, you get more cosmic rays getting through the magnetic field, you get more clouds, the Earth gets cooler. And there seems to be a correlation between some of these mini ice ages and the activity of the sun slowing down. Now I'm going to show you another chart. Okay, this is cosmic radiation and temperature on the bottom, and you see that up there. Carbon dioxide over, I think these are years, to 2000. Now, what's the relationship of carbon dioxide to these things?
None.
Doesn't seem to have any relationship that I can see. So, do you think that they would be telling us a fraud? The whole thing is just a big fat lie that they made up out of whole cloth, that this is the actual figures? Now, it actually gets to be more fun because it turns out that I guess carbon dioxide is increasing due to industry and things like that. So what's actually occurred, because plants eat carbon dioxide, is that we have 11% more vegetation on the planet since we started having all this industry, so that the plant life is actually really growing because of the carbon dioxide. And I'll read you the little blurb that goes with the study. You can see the chart, right, that this shade of green is a 10 to 20% increase in vegetation, which you see a lot of. This is a 0 to 10% increase in vegetation. So on most of the planet's actually greening. There's actually more trees, more shrubs, more plant life on the planet. And this is just in the last, 34 years, 82 to 2006. So the blurb that goes under this is, the study from which the image is drawn analyzed plant growth at desert margins and other semi-arid areas and found an 11% net growth in foliage ground cover during 82 through 2006. Growth attributed to improved water use efficiency arising from higher atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. The study's authors conclude, our results confirm that the anticipated CO2 fertilization effect is occurring alongside ongoing anthropogenic perturbations to the carbon cycle, and that the fertilization effect is now a significant land surface process. As CO2 levels continue to rise, the Earth will grow greener and agricultural yields will continue to increase, with additional contributions from better varieties, improved cropping practices, more efficient use of fertilizer, and other factors. So, carbon dioxide could actually help us feed more people, the exact opposite of what they have told us. Now, how are they using these lies? I went to a meeting, when did I go to this meeting? Thursday, of a group called the Storm Surge Working Group. It's engineers in New York. And what they have been working on, I'm very happy that my hypothesis from around the time of Hurricane Sandy, they concurred with what I thought would be the best. You see this map. Whoops. So this is a sea gate that was proposed way back in 2009 by Halcrow, an American engineering firm. It's only 5 miles to go from Sandy Hook in New Jersey up to the Rockaways here. But you see, if you built this sea gate, what you're protecting is Staten Island, the ports at Elizabeth and Newark, all of Manhattan, LaGuardia Airport, all of this, all the things that were totally destroyed in Sandy. And the way these gates work, they have various of them around the world, this would be one of the larger ones, is that it's open most of the time. And what I learned is apparently if 85% of the water is able to flow during normal times, then the marine life and everything else is not affected. It's as if you've done nothing. So if you can keep the flow of the water, which they do, and then when you know that a storm is coming, you put the gates in place so that you have a barrier protecting this. Now, this makes a great deal of sense to me. When they proposed doing it in 2009, the cost of building it was $7 billion. They didn't build it. And when Sandy hit, we didn't have it, and people have some sense of what the devastation was everywhere, including emphatically with the transportation system in the area and otherwise. It is about to be the 6th anniversary of Sandy. What has been built?
Nothing.
Exactly, nothing. So this is not even a case of speculating what if such and such a thing happens. It already has happened at the pace of the hurricanes that we're having, and I'll stress again, we still don't know why or how they're generated or what. I mean, we know nothing about this process relative to what we could know. We can presume that this will happen again. And nothing has been built. And the excuse, the New York City Council has come up with a brilliant resolution saying that the Army Corps of Engineers has no business talking about this barrier because the real problem we have to contend with is sea level rising as a result of global warming. And I told a joke at this meeting. I said, well, maybe we should have King Canute come to the city council meeting. And only one person laughed, everybody. But anyway, and what's the sea level rise supposedly according to the measure down at Lower Manhattan? It's supposedly 1 foot per year. I mean, not per year, 1 foot per century.
Yeah.
1 foot per, supposedly. But if you talk to Tom Weissmuller, who's addressing our Manhattan meeting next week, who's an expert from NASA on oceanography and meteorology and so on, the sea level is not actually rising planet-wide. And I can say that myself, I was at a place in Sweden 2 years ago where the land is rising by 1 meter a century. So it could also perhaps be the possibility that our planet is not finished forming. It could also be, as Weissmuller has suggested, that when you put tons of concrete and steel, and these are heavy things, and you put tons and tons and tons and tons of them somewhere, that the ground sinks. In other words, we don't know what this is, but I think we could know that this barrier would work. But they're arguing we can't even talk about it unless you figure out how to stop the sea level from rising. I mean, it's really insane. So why? Why would anybody promote such nonsense? Who is behind this? And you'll see in the report, which I really recommend at the end of the meeting, you know, picking up a copy of this report. It's $20 or something, but because we go through the British and also how the Pope got taken over by Lord Schellenhuber. Is that in this, or is this?
Yes.
Yeah. By Lord Schellenhuber, who's a German scientist who got knighted by the Queen of England to promote the idea that the world can only hold less than 1 billion people, and what we should all do is stop eating meat and so on. I think what they really want to get to is cannibalism, but they can't say that just yet. But anyway, you can. So what is the point of this? And I'll tell you, the reason why they are pushing this so fanatically right now is because, as we saw in the triple curve, the transatlantic financial system, London and Wall Street, are bankrupt. Their system is going to collapse. If nations in Africa and South America and Asia develop their own economies and are committed to a rising standard of physical production, then the looters, the British Empire, will no longer have any power. And that is also, I would say, why they hate President Trump so much. Because if the United States works with Russia and with China and with India, then there is no way possible that the British are going to be able to play their old games like the opium wars and the free trade zones and the drug legal and everything that they've done. Now, a lot of this has already been done. And I would say the main target right now actually is China and what China is doing in Africa. Anyone know where this is? Africa. It's Ethiopia. This is the new, and they're saying Ethiopia is now developing so quickly that Ethiopia may be the new China of Africa. The standard of living is skyrocketing. The last time this is the new railroad from Djibouti to Addis Ababa. I'll show you the map here. Right, there's Ethiopia was landlocked because they hived off this part, typical colonial Eritrea. So they did not have any way to get to the ocean. And every time there'd be a drought, I mean, we all saw these pictures 20, 30 years ago of the starving babies and the horrible situation. Well, now, this is the railroad that the Chinese and Ethiopian governments just built together from Djibouti to the capital of Ethiopia. So the last time they had a major drought, nobody died, because they could get food and water and everything they needed. And as you saw from that train looked a lot better shape than what I've seen in some of the New York subways. You know, so they've got a new modern rail system, and I forget if it's Ethiopia or Kenya, but they're now building an engineering school to educate the populations of these countries to totally take these things over. Although the workforce, I understand, was 90% African and 10% Chinese. So it is not, it's hard for us to imagine, having been under this colonial outlook for so long, that the Chinese intent is not rape, pillage, and plunder, but it is not. They're not going in there and chopping people's hands off if they don't mine the gold and the diamonds. Their perspective is much longer term, which Franklin Roosevelt had expressed, which is that it's very short-sighted to just rip off raw materials and leave people starving. You're going to just have perpetual war and chaos, and whereas if people's standard of living rises, then you're creating a market for your goods. You're creating a trading partner over generations, and the population of the continent of Africa right now is 1.2 billion people. And 41% of them are 15 years old or younger. So what they're thinking about is, how do we inspire our young people? How do we have an educational system that allows these people to become geniuses? And you will notice these are huge developments. You ever see a word about it in the US press? Nothing. I think they're afraid that if Americans saw this going on in Africa, they'd say, you know, why the heck aren't we doing this? Are we-
Immigration.
Right, are we worse off than Ethiopia was, that we can't figure out how to build a modern railroad? So the target especially is Africa. When Barack Obama went to South Africa when he was president, he gave the most disgusting speech. If Donald Trump had ever given that speech, they would have put a Ku Klux Klan robe on him and, marched him off to be hanged. Because what Obama did is he went to South Africa and he said, now, all of you people can't have air conditioners and automobiles because the planet will boil over. I mean, you think about it. The other thing I wanted to say, just before closing here, and then we can take questions or whatever, is also, not surprisingly, British geopolitics. Until a few years ago, Eritrea and Ethiopia were in a bloody, bloody war. Djibouti, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, all these countries were at war. Since this railroad has been completed, and there's been another number of conferences, these four nations are now all in the process of signing and negotiating, completing major peace agreements. So you're actually ending war. If you think about President Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping, his work with Putin, and then the work that China and Russia both are doing on the Koreas, and Trump's work on Korea, the fact that we have a president who is willing to meet with these leaders creates the condition where you can actually have peace. And the point of this is, as I said, if the United States works with China, Russia, and India to create a four-power agreement to get a new monetary system, then the British system will be dead. And we could actually, this is hard for people to imagine, but we could actually live in a world without war, and in a world where the future would be that our population is populating other galaxies, and populating these galaxies with geniuses, poets, classical musicians, and so on. And to close, I'll just say this is what's actually at stake in the November midterm elections.
Pretty good.
So, any questions?
Dan, I have a question.
Yeah.
We know how critical U.S.-China relationships need to be for obviously this to, for Belt and Road, Fall
Right.
Powers Agreement, the on, not comes. I'm a little confused when I go to the LaRouche meetings and I hear about, positive, negatives about what Trump is doing and regarding the tariffs and all of that. By no means am I an economist, I have no idea. I often look at this and my question is it a smokescreen, for argument's sake, to throw the British off the scent? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But at the same time, are there true problems between the two that, via back channel, they're trying to work out? And this is the smoke
Right.
show.
Well, I think all of what you're saying is possible. I mean, the first and foremost, I would say, is the biggest problem we have is the ongoing coup against the president. Because his own administration has people, like, think about going into the meeting with Kim Jong-un. And it was Mattis who said, if they don't cooperate, we're gonna give them the Libya treatment. Well, the Libya treatment is you going over, I mean, that was not helpful to the negotiation. So why does Mattis say this? So one problem you have because of this coup, until we can put people like Robert Mueller and Obama in jail.
Where they belong.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Is that you have so many factors at play and such an attack on the president that people in his own administration are expressing a policy which is not his. Like the Vice President Pence, who just made this raving anti-China speech, and then President Trump sent Pompeo over to meet with the Chinese, so they're getting all these mixed signals. And then there is a factor of Trump's approach to negotiations, which, you know, many of us might not do, like Rocket Man, and we're gonna blow you off the planet, and, you know, so it's very hard to.
It's hard to
But then
gauge.
I think that's Queen's real estate, or, you know, something is where that comes from. So you don't know. I do think that there obviously is a trade imbalance. We shut down our production, and I appreciate what Trump said when he was in China, where they treated him very well, and he described that visit. He said those 2 days were among the most magical days of my life. I mean, they just did an incredible thing for him and Melania there. And at the dinner, he said to Xi Jinping, he said, look, I don't blame you for the trade imbalance. You were looking out for China, but our previous administrations were not looking out for the United States. Now, what the Chinese have said, which we think would be a better approach, instead of cutting and crushing and, you know, suppressing production, why not actually massively increase production all around? Suppose the U.S. and suppose the United States decided to get in with the Chinese on the development of Africa, for example, and work together. Would that not, there's 1 billion plus people who are about to need washing machines and all kinds of things that we could produce. So instead of squabbling over the limited pie of production that we have right now,
Bill?
yeah, say, why don't we massively increase what we're producing, and the American component of this will be much bigger than it has been up to now. And you can take a lot of cases. South America would be an obvious one. We're right here. And the discussions that Trump has had with the, you know, president-elect, I guess he hasn't been sworn in yet, Obrador of Mexico, are very interesting in that regard. Because they said if you really want to solve immigration, you can't just stop people at the border. Mexico has to have industry. You can't have a zillion drug gangs running around shooting everybody. So how do you address these things in a way that is mutually beneficial to both sides? And the Chinese, remember, are holding $1.2 trillion of U.S. Treasury bonds. The Japanese hold a similar amount. They would love nothing more than to invest that in building infrastructure here. Right now, we're not that great of an investment. If you can ship goods into the port at Elizabeth, you can't get them very far. The average speed, you probably know this, of a freight train in the U.S. is 20 miles an hour. So, yeah, so if you're trying to do business with us, you know, anyway, so I think it's all of those things. It's confusing, and that's why we're saying these elections are so critical, because we've got to take the coup off the table. That's the first thing. And then we have to have a movement of citizens who refuse to swallow this crap we're being force-fed.